Good evening. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so honored to be here tonight with the Asian American Alliance of Marin for this really important presentation, Casualties of War, the new Exclusion Act. The panel tonight is looking at the immigration experience of Southeast Asian Americans, in particular from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, who have come to the U.S. as refugees. And these Southeast Asian American communities are struggling with the double trauma of war and displacement in Asia on the one hand, and discrimination, violence, poverty, and structural racism here in the U.S. on the other hand. All of our speakers are deeply familiar with the trauma of the Southeast Asian refugee experience and seek to help heal and safeguard these members of our community who have experienced transgenerational trauma, which is passed down from adults to children, as well as cultural trauma and the loss of social anchoring and shared cultural identity. The U.S. relocated already traumatized refugee populations from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia by essentially dumping them into the poorest neighborhoods in the U.S. without the necessary resources to not only process transgenerational and cultural trauma, but thrive through access to quality education and safe living in educational environments. Our Southeast Asian American refugee communities have been struggling with repeated traumatization from U.S. war experiences and fleeing for safety to the camps in Thailand, to facing the violence and poverty of U.S. structural racism and iniquity. All of our panelists today will speak to the unique mental health struggles that these Southeast Asian American communities face, as well as the consequences of structural racism in the U.S. that funnels members of these targeted communities into the school-to-prison pipeline. They then face the added precarity and danger of deportation under recent U.S. immigration legislation that targets Southeast Asian Americans. So this is a very important panel tonight. Our first speaker can't be here in person, but we do have a talk that she recorded for us. Our first speaker is Dr. Pollie Bith-Melander. She was born in Cambodia and immigrated to the United States at age 10 years old. As the program director and chair of social work department at California State University Stanislaus, she conducts research in Southeast Asia and in the United States with a focus on ethnomedicine, refugees, and community mental health and trauma. She produced a visual ethnography on the 1.5 generation of Southeast Asian refugee deportation entitled Exiled Once Again, which we'll see excerpts from shortly, and following that, she will give her brief recorded talk that she made for this panel. She is currently working on the second part of the series, which is going to be called Invisible.
Prior to the Vietnam War, Cambodia was relatively peaceful. During the Vietnam War, things sort of fell apart. The Vietnam War wasn't just restricted to Vietnam. Spilled over to Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia. Cambodia wanted to remain neutral, but the U.S. wasn't happy with that because it needs space to conduct war in Vietnam.
America had a lot of firepower. They just wiped out entire villages that were thought to be on the communist side.
It was about communism. The fear of communists would take over Southeast Asia and therefore ultimately take over other parts of the world. And I think that the Vietnam War was really about that for the US. Cambodians were in this weird position. We know this is not about saving Vietnam or saving Southeast Asia. This war is about cultural identity, a sense of nationalism. I was born in Cambodia in the very last part of the Vietnam War, during the most turbulent times. The U.S. was about to pull out, the Khmer Rouge was about to take control. I don't remember much other than the fact that I truly thought that I was going to die every day. Just constant bomb explosions and guns went off. you see death, you hear explosion. So there's this constant fear of your life is about to end. Under the Pol Pot regime, the country closed its border. Cambodia was essentially in the dark.
Totally shut down. Totally shut down. We in the States knew nothing about the Khmer Rouge.
But that was the end of the world. Nothing worked, there was nothing left. There was no hospital, there was no school. I remember some of my sisters said, you know, if we stay, we die. But if we go, we live. So my mom said, well, let's just go. We're just gonna go. We just kept going, running. All of us were together, we just kept running. Through that entire time from 1978 when Vietnam invaded Cambodia to late 1979, it felt like we were just following people. And the people we follow, I'm sure they didn't know where they were going, but all of us were following each other. And I think we found the Red Cross. We didn't know who they were, but there were cars, there were trucks taking people, and we're like, oh, why don't we just do that? We'll go with them. We got on a truck. The next thing you knew, we ended up in Cao Dang refugee camp. We got dumped in West Oakland.
Between 1975 and 1993, the United States admitted about 1.5 million refugees from Southeast Asia. The new wave of refugees that came in the late 70s and early 80s were tribals, Hmong, Mien, Lahu, Khmu, mostly from Laos, or peasant villagers from remote areas of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. I saw them arrive at the airport with their agricultural tools because they thought they were going to just take up the same kind of life that they'd had back home. People who were wholly unprepared to adapt to life in urban America, and they were put into communities that were crime-ridden, that had the poorest schools, and where the social workers and most of the teachers had no idea where they were coming from, who they were, or where they could be going in the future.
There wasn't a lot of thought or resources put into helping Cambodian refugees assimilate or integrate into U.S. Culture and society. And they were also resettled in neighborhoods across the U.S. where really no one else wanted to live. Neighborhoods with really high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, failing schools, high rates of gang violence.
West Oakland in the 80s, you see drugs, you see gun violence. I remember the first gun went off. We thought we were back to places we just left. Remember, we'd gone through a lot from the Vietnam War, the Pol Pot regime, the Vietnamese invasion, being abused at the border with the guerrilla, with the Khmer Rouge, with the Thai soldiers, and then again at the refugee camp. By then, I was almost 10 years old. And I remember feeling somewhat safe, that we perhaps might be okay. And that was a false hope, because when we landed in the San Francisco airport, a dump in West Oakland, that sense of feeling safe, that disappeared quite quickly. Hello, my name is Pollie Bith-Melander. I'm the Chair and Program Director of the Social Work Department at CSU Stanislaus. And I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. Would love to. Nevertheless, here it is. So let me start with the definition of trauma. Trauma affects all of us. Trauma is defined as having a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, which can include a physical injury. It can affect the social fabric of a nation or culture. The DSM-5 criterion for trauma is very precise. It involves either direct exposure or witnessing in person. Cultural trauma is a little bit different, however. It's a complex conceptual process. It is deep-rooted at the collective level in an event such as a war, natural disaster, or a genocide that took place in a country such as Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime. Transgenerational trauma or historical trauma is defined as the subjective experiencing and remembering of events in the mind of an individual or the life of a community that pass from adults to children in cyclic processes as collective emotional and psychological injury through the prohibition of the use of language that is in tune with the cultural beliefs and values, spiritual and healing practices, and access to public spaces. Historical trauma caused traumatic loss of identity and meaning, cultural identity and cultural conceptions of reality. In other words, people are prone to anxiety and related symptoms if they lose their cultural worldview. Our beliefs and values and practices anchor us like a boat to an anchor. And a cultural identity and cultural conception of reality anchor a person's sense of self-worth. Cultural trauma seems to inhibit these values and are innately important in the survivability and functionality of a population. Now, let me move on to talk a little bit about the manifestation of trauma. The manifestation of trauma tends to be depending on what individual is experiencing and how the individual is dealing with that particular traumatic event. The manifestations are either they freeze, they flight, they fight, or they fright. Trauma is passed down from one generation of trauma survivor to the next, and so on, down through the generations of the survivor offspring. Tends to manifest in complex PTSD. The most obvious evidence, though, in literature on the intergenerational effects of parents' traumas concern those who survived the Holocaust, where individuals experience PTSD but without ever have any experience of post-traumatic stress or traumatic events that would lead to post-traumatic stress, and can talk about it in detail. And this is in part what they find out was that the parents who lived through the Holocaust ended up with feeling the symptoms of PTSD and pass those symptoms down to the next generation, even though the next generation did not experience any kind of traumatic events, such as extreme fears or feeling on edge, just constantly feeling anxious. Complex PTSD manifests as a set of symptoms resulting from, again, repeated and prolonged stress of a social or interpersonal in nature. So if you have repeated trauma as a community and through time, your offspring or the next generation will more likely to feel the impact of that trauma as well. Some specific symptoms that you may see: explosion of emotions or vitality of emotions. Hyperarousal is the other one, and pervasive fear, of course, anxiety. This is an adaptive response intended to keep a person away from similar dangerous situations in the future. Indulge me for one moment on looking at, if we think about the evolutionary perspective on trauma, these symptoms are meant to serve as a warning sign. But these symptoms at the same time created a problem or a challenge. They are detrimental to the daily functioning of a human being once they experience a traumatic event. Now, I'm not saying that all people will acquire all these symptoms. Some could just live and figuring out a way to cope with these symptoms. But there are others who probably are a bit more prone, whether it's because of transgenerational trauma or because they lack the coping skill to address these, what they witness and what they're feeling. Trauma impacts a community from one generation to the next. Additional violence experienced after resettlement in America adversely affects a community, for example. And patterns of trauma. Southeast Asian in the Vietnam War, these refugees arrived in the U.S. suffering from PTSD with limited education, fragmented English proficiency. Many were prone to poverty, crime, and violence after resettlement in the U.S. So this is a classic example of repeated trauma as well. And then the cycle of violence and trauma continue with recent deportation of refugees from the U.S. to their native countries, back to the very situation and governments that prosecuted them in the first place. And the migration experience contributed to more trauma in the lives of some of the folks resettled in the U.S., particularly API. We see abuse at the refugee camps with Myanmar population, the minority population, and those who have escaped the violence from Myanmar, from their native country. Similarly, with the Southeast Asian, after the Vietnam War, after the Pol Pot regime, certainly in the refugee camps in Thailand, for example, continue to feel abuse and they experience more violence there. And then, of course, the issue of assimilation. Mainstream society here in the U.S. Created further challenges for them. Struggle to assimilate, may have undergone torture, psychological, physical trauma, separation, and loss of family members. All of these compounded to the issues that they face in a new country, in a strange land. And then seeking help is not a simple process either, considering the extreme stigma and shame surrounding mental illness in the API community. And again, API is not a homogenous group of people. We have different languages, different cultures, which complicate it further. One of the things that I wanted to stress before I concluded this, these symptoms people experience, whether it's PTSD or other, such as extreme anxiety, fear of leaving the house, feeling on edge, these symptoms don't go away, even if you build the proper coping skills to address them. Once you're under stress, the body produces cortisol, and we know that cortisol leads to all kinds of issues, including inflammation. And again, under stress, a person who already have all these symptoms, even if they learn how to manage them, can exacerbate it under stress. So a couple points. Again, trauma is transmissible. Trauma pass on from one generation to the next. 2 is that once you acquire a symptom, even if you develop coping skills, these symptoms don't go away. And then the final point is that stress tend to exacerbate it, if not resurface some of these symptoms. So it's important to sort of treat those who are being treated for trauma-related experiences should consider that this is sort of a cyclic process and an ongoing support from family, from community. And healing starts with understanding cultural practices, beliefs, and values, because those things are important to our identity, and that's what anchor us, despite the fact that we may have some challenges in the way we experience the world. And of course, the recent intensity of the fighting in the Middle East with the Israeli and with the Palestinians, these kind of dramatic events can really contribute to create a collective trauma or complex trauma of a community, and therefore through time we'll continue to feel those symptoms. So seeking support is really important, and understanding how trauma impacts the brain. We know that our brain is kind of similar to our fingerprint. No single brain is the same, and we also know that nothing gets lost in our brain, right? It's just there, stores away, and will come under a traumatic event in the most inconvenient time. All of a sudden you feel like you're overwhelmed. But it's all these past trauma that actually comes. It's just being triggered by one small event or major event. One never knows what triggers. And we'll call this trauma response. So it's important to look at those things as well as we move forward with understanding how trauma impacts or affects the community through time. And especially with the API community, with us being complex with just a sheer amount of diversity in terms of language and culture. And thank you for listening.
So our next panelist is Dr. Tran Nguyen. She is a licensed Vietnamese English bilingual behavioral health practitioner with Marin County Behavioral Health and Recovery Services. Besides regular case management, assessments, and therapy, she also specializes in cultural brokerage and culturally appropriate crisis intervention and treatment planning for Vietnamese-speaking adult patients with severe mental illnesses. As a clinical supervisor and community coeducator, she collaborates with Dominican University of California Service Learning Program in an ongoing oral history collection with Vietnamese immigrant elders in Marin County. So if we could welcome Dr. Tran Nguyen.
Hi everyone. This topic is really dear and close to me. My name is Tran. I am a second generation Vietnamese American, born and raised in the South Bay in San Jose. Both my parents are boat people that came from Vietnam as refugees. They both came here in 1979. So here's actually a picture that I found in my dad's possession. So this is my dad here on the left, far left. He's the 9th of 10 children in Vietnam. The middle is my uncle, my fifth uncle. He was a single dad, and that's his daughter. So that's my cousin. Growing up as a second generation Vietnamese American, I struggled with the culture of silence. My family, even though they went through all this trauma and immigration, all this experience, don't talk about their trauma. They, I see photos once in a while. I find things in their possession, but there's no stories behind it. They kind of say, yeah, we came here in 1979, moving on. So this photo I found coincidentally, and I asked my dad if I could have it, and he was like, okay, but no details. But my cousin, from what she can remember, she was 7 years old at the time, told me that this was their photo when they were in the refugee camp in Malaysia. So this is after they got off the boat, and this was their ID photo and their numbers, and that's how they were grouped together. So my cousin also told me, even though she was part of the boat experience, she's not allowed to talk about it. And so even now at family gatherings and things like that, we're discouraged from asking questions. I definitely grew up in a culture of silence around kind of the refugee experience, and as a second generation Vietnamese American, I grew up actually really envious of my cousin. And I remember my dad was saying, that's silly, you grew up here, you're very privileged, why would you envy your cousin? And I was like, because her trauma makes sense. She went with you on the boat and had that experience, whereas I was born here, we're still traumatized in a different way, but I didn't get to have that experience. Like having, I was born in San Jose, but traumatized by my parents growing up. So I grew up telling my parents it's hard for different generations because of a lot of untreated trauma. So, not surprisingly, in California, only 2% of AAPIs actually utilize mental health resources. So that's all of AAPIs, right? And if you're looking at that, the portion of Southeast Asians using mental health services is even smaller. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma in this community because if you're not seeking the services to treat your mental health, what happens is you pass it on to other generations. There's things that are passed on such as parent and child conflicts, different parenting issues. Trauma can worsen over generations. And there's also a culture of silence, which is what I grew up with in my particular family. And when I was thinking about intergenerational traumas, I actually asked some of my friends, what were some of the things that we grew up and how did we get traumatized by our immigrant parents? And my friend was like, don't you remember college? So what happened when I went to college was I never realized the trauma until you left the house. When I went to college, I ended up rooming with other Southeast Asian Americans. And how it came about was our parents met each other. They liked each other. Oh, we're similar. Yes, you can live with those kids. But what we ended up realizing is that we all hoard a behavior that we learned from our parents. Hoarding food. There was 4 of us, and we had 200 pounds of rice in the apartment. Things like that. And, we had cans of food. The way we shopped and the way we, stored stuff just didn't make sense. But we didn't realize that until we were outside of our home. So we would go to other apartments and be like, they don't have 200 pounds of rice. They just go buy food when they need it. How does that make any sense? But so my friend was saying, we were traumatized. Lots of behaviors that we've had to really unpack. And that, particularly for me, has been a challenge because now I have young children. So I'm trying to figure out what is learned, what was taught from my parents, and what do I want to change as I move forward in parenting. On top of all the trauma, things like that, Dr. Pollie mentioned, right, Southeast Asian Americans have very limited English proficiency. 36 to 50% of all Southeast Asians are not proficient in English. So basically it means that they have trouble reading basic forms, making basic phone calls, things like that. And compared to the total population in the US, only 19% have trouble with English. So disproportionately, this population struggles with basic needs and kind of just accessing resources. On top of all that, Southeast Asians also have lower academic attainments compared to other US adults. 34% of Laotian, 38% of Cambodian, 39% of Hmong, and 30% of Vietnamese American adults do not have a high school diploma. So that's significantly higher compared to the 14% of average US adults. In California, Laotian, Cambodians, and Hmong Americans have the lower ratios of native language speaking physicians and nurses. So essentially, even when they do seek services, there are not culturally appropriate and linguistically appropriate care provided to them. There's a lot of challenges for Southeast Asian Americans, and why I'm passionate about this topic is growing up, I always felt like we were grouped in as the model minority. Even in my high schools, they said, the rate of college attendance for Asian Americans is really high. So they would tell me, you have nothing to worry about. But in reality, as children of both people, I would be the first generation to go to college. My parents had no idea how college worked in this country. They didn't speak very good English either. Yeah, being grouped with the model minority has really impacted a lot of the resources or what was available for my parents growing up. So specifically in Marin County, how I ended up in Marin County was very random. When I was doing my graduate studies, I was looking for internships that specifically worked with Vietnamese populations. And you know, they had the same, like in San Jose, had a lot of nonprofits, RAMs and SF had positions, but then randomly Marin showed up wanting like bilingual Vietnamese interns. So that's how I ended up here. I actually ended up in a forensic program with the county. However, there were very few Vietnamese or even Asian Americans in the forensic program. So basically people were going straight to jail or prison versus going to the mental health pipeline. How I ended up was I was hired onto a different team just because they thought my skills were not as well utilized on the forensic side just because there was few Asian Americans. So specifically in Marin County, Vietnamese is the largest of the Southeast Asian American ethnicities. So it's under 1%. I think it's about 0.5% in this county. All the other Southeast Asian ethnic groups are ethnic groups under others just because the percentage is so low. In Marin County, though, Vietnamese is not a threshold language, which means that it is not mandatory for things to be translated into Vietnamese. It is just a priority language, so sometimes services are translated. So that's something to note about Marin County, right, versus all the neighboring counties, like SF, Oakland, all the other larger counties have threshold languages for many Asian languages. In Marin County, only Spanish is a threshold language. In Marin County, 1.2% of Vietnamese Americans are Medi-Cal beneficiaries, so they identify as low income or no insurance. And within the county behavioral health, we serve Marin County Behavioral Health Services. 1.3% of the services are utilized by individuals identifying as Vietnamese Americans. It's only 1.3. It's a very small percentage. However, I think the stats are not totally accurate because a lot of people who identify as Vietnamese in this county are not actually Vietnamese. They just categorize themselves in that way to get services. A lot of them are actually other Southeast Asian groups, but because there was so much movement during the war and displacement that they speak a lot of languages, so because they speak Vietnamese, they will just mark I'm Vietnamese to get the services. But if we actually did the count, I think the ethnic groups would actually show up more. Even in my job, a lot of clients will select that they're Vietnamese, but they're actually Cambodian, but they're fluent in Vietnamese. That's something I think is really lost within this county. And basically, there's actually a lot of just challenges to accessing care. A lot of our clients, there's a lot of stigma. And it's something to note is, even though I work in mental health, my parents and family do not seek mental health services, and they need it. Especially like my dad and my uncle, they went through a lot during the war, but they just don't seek services. They don't want anyone to know their story. They feel like they're fine, even though they're not fine. And they tell people I work in mental health, but they themselves will not seek help. Language is also a big piece. There are few providers that speak Southeast Asian languages. Very few. If you go online and Google for how many like psychologists or master's level therapists that speak those languages, very few. And unfortunately, a lot of the ones that do speak the languages actually go into private sectors, and they're not necessarily in the community due to poor pay and kind of high caseloads and things like that. So it's actually very difficult to find providers. And there's also a lack of just culturally and linguistically appropriate services across the board. Particularly like in Marin County, some of our challenges has been because Vietnamese is not a threshold language, there's no requirement to have services, certain services in that language. So that creates a barrier for many of our community members. It's definitely a challenge, but in Marin County, we have adapted some of the mental health services is by being more in the community. So we take on more of a case management approach versus traditional therapy. So we do a lot more case management. I take a lot of clients to medical appointments a lot. That helps me build rapport. I go to their house and I eat snacks with them. And so kind of doing whatever it takes to build that trust and that relationship. Definitely mainstream models of mental health treatment has not been successful with this community. And I think a lot of work still needs to be put into the recruitment and building more diverse provider services for this community. And then for Marin County, we do have an access line though that anyone can call if you were interested in services or if you wanted to link anyone else to services. It's a good number just to call to get information, or they can direct you to wherever you need to go. Thank you.